Gil wrote an really outstanding piece. I write a lot about and do coverage on this show a lot about the culture of high tech and that its impact on the world. And Gil wrote has been covering that really, really well. I've wanted to talk to him for a long time. His latest piece in the New Republic is headlined "Where J.D. Vance Gets His Weird, Terrifying Techno Authoritarian Ideas." And if you think that headline is overselling the content, stick around. So first of all, Gil Duran, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So things have been breaking your way beat-wise lately because first J.D. Vance, who is very much a creature of the Silicon Valley, gets added to the Democratic ticket, and Kamala Harris ascends to the top of the, I'm sorry, to the Republican ticket. Kamala ascends to the top of the Democratic ticket. And you've been covering this culture for a while. Tell me what is weird and terrifying, first of all, about J.D. Vance's ideas, and then we'll talk about where they come from.
J.D. Vance has been deeply influenced by writers who believe very explicitly that democracy is a failed system and that dictatorship is preferable, specifically dictatorship by corporate governments, obviously tech corporate governments. As part of that idea, he wants to, if Trump wins, take over government and get rid of the civil service, basically rip out anybody who's a Democrat with a small d, meaning people who believe in democracy, and replace them with loyalist MAGA types who will do anything that the dictator or boss or president believes or desires. As we both know, or most of us know, the civil service was created specifically to avoid this kind of political patronage government, which leads to massive corruption generally. And as part of that, going beyond just replacing government with loyalists, he compares it to denazification or debothification, like we did in Iraq when we try to get rid of members of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party. He believes that government, once you have it, should be used ruthlessly. Use the machinery of government ruthlessly to get what you want and to cement your power, instead of playing this little patty cake game where every 4 years we decide who the leader is. So in a nutshell, he has been among people and embraced a set of beliefs in a place where people are comfortable saying that dictatorship should replace democracy. And it is no coincidence that he has gone from comparing Trump to America's Hitler to being his running mate. And I have to wonder if when he compared him to Hitler, he didn't mean that as a compliment, given
Right,
what I know about him.
It's funny, I've had the same thought of, but you say that like it's a bad thing. And Gil Duran, I had not seen the full quote of J.D. Vance's, which you put in your piece in the New Republic. First of all, de-Baathification, where they took every member of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party and struck them from the government, he doesn't seem to realize was catastrophic administratively. Exactly. It just threw the country into chaos because George Bush's incompetent appointees were running that at the time. Denazification is a horrifying choice of words because it's suggesting, and this to me is reflective of your and other coverage of the Silicon Valley extreme views, because it suggests that any form of government to them is totalitarian, that any form of democratic rule is a Nazi-like infringement on their freedom to do whatever they want as billionaires and so on. And we should seize the institutions of the left. So they're also characterizing democracy itself, I guess, as being on the left. And, this is what J.D. Vance believes in. And say what you will about the guy, he's not stupid. I mean, he's a bright guy. He has a great academic career. So it's not like he can't back it up. But he then said, you go on to quote him as saying, I think what Trump should do, one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every single civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. It is as terrifying as anyone can imagine, and he calls his plan rage for retire all government employees. You also make a great point, and I'm just hammering on Vance before we get to the background, that this, while it sounds like bold, innovative, throw caution to the winds thinking, it also happens to coincide perfectly with Project 2025, which is that old right wing, stale Heritage Foundation's blueprint, which also calls for firing 500,000, 500,000 federal employees, dismantling whole agencies, and all that. So it seems that the new radical left and the old extremist left, they're kind of converging in I mean, people have,
The right. Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, on the right. Yeah, not the left,
On
right?
the, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're kind of converging. I better stop misspeaking like this, or I'm going to have to step down. But and as you say, Vance didn't get this extremism from his Appalachian upbringing or Yale law. It was incubated in the tech capital, and you've written about that before. Let's talk about that a little bit, about Peter Thiel and the philosopher king of the so-called Thielverse, Thiel and his billionaire friends and so on. What's that all about?
I think an important thing to understand is that J.D. Vance is largely a creation of Peter Thiel. J.D. Vance, well, we mostly know him for hillbilly elegy and his supposedly hard Scrabble upbringing in Ohio. Ended up at Yale Law, and in 2011, I believe it was, Peter Thiel gave a talk there. And in the talk, he kind of goaded the law students and said, shouldn't be wasting your time in elite schools learning these dusty old trades. You should be in Silicon Valley, which is where all the change is happening, where the future is going to come from. Uh, J.D. Vance goes back to his apartment and feverishly researches Peter Thiel and finally finds an address for him and emails Peter Thiel, cold email. I don't know what the email said, but Peter Thiel writes back and says, if you ever come in California, come and visit me. Um, After law school, Vance practices law for less than a year and a half, I think less than 2 years, and then beeline straight out to California and ends up working at Mithril Capital, a venture capital fund co-founded by Peter Thiel. After a bit of a time there, he decides to go back to Ohio and start his own fund. And lo and behold, he's able to raise, I think, north of $90 million with help from Peter Thiel and from Mark Andreessen. So he makes these connections and goes back to Ohio. And, just like everybody in California, come out here, somebody will give you $90 million to go home and do something else, right? That doesn't really actually happen for everybody. Well, within a couple of years after that, Vance decides to run for Senate. And lo and behold, Peter Thiel drops an unprecedented $15 million into his campaign. And not only that, he gets Trump to endorse Vance after Vance had called Trump reprehensible, called him an idiot, compared him to an opioid, and compared him to Hitler. Trump endorses Vance. Vance wins in a very close race and jumps onto the national stage in the U.S. Senate. And then once again, this time around, Thiel played a role in getting all these other tech billionaires to push Trump and the Trump boys to make Vance vice president. So you have to understand the degree to which Vance is a creature of Thiel. Peter Thiel has said, as far back as I think 2009, I no longer believe freedom and democracy are compatible. He's part of a group of neo-reactionary Silicon Valley billionaires who explicitly believe that democracy is not the preferable operating system of government or society. And as part of that milieu, which some call the Thielverse, the people around Peter Thiel, there's a guy named Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin has written copious amounts of gobbledygook online. You can go and read it yourself. It's all free. And among his works is something called Patchwork, which argues for the creation of dictatorships to replace democracy, specifically corporate dictatorships, corporate tech dictatorships. And um, this is the ferment from which J.D. Vance's idea to fire all government employees comes from rage, retire all government employees comes from a talk that Curtis Jarvin gave in 2012, in which he said exactly that, in which he also said Americans need to get over their uh, phobia of dictatorship.
I think the exact language you quote from Curtis Yarvin in your piece is actually, I'm not clear whether it's Teal or Yarvin, but if Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia. Um, some
That's
phobias
Jarvin.
are not actually phobias. That's Yarvin. They aren't actually phobias, they're rational fears. So this is Yarvin. And you're saying that this guy is popular with Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is the sort of creator of J.D. Vance as a politician, initiator of J.D. Vance as a politician. And what you've done here is draw, in my mind, a clear through line between this extremist world radical philosophy of the right, far more radical than anything we've heard from the right in many years, and actual concrete proposals that now are being generated by the Heritage Foundation, the Republican Party ticket, and specifically from the potential vice president of the United States, a heartbeat away from the presidency. So this is scary stuff. And I want to talk for a second, Gil, about the motivations of the people behind all this. And as you write, people talk about political commentators when they talk about all the money, massive amounts of money tech billionaires are throwing into politics. They talk about taxes and regulations, but you said something insightful here. You said tech plutocrats like Thiel and Elon Musk already have money. Now they want power as much as money can buy, end quote. To which I would add, they also think they're the most brilliant people on the planet and the most capable. So to me, what I look at are people who got where they were, frankly, because of pathologies in their personality that allow them to pursue this kind of dominance at the expense of other human emotions and behaviors. And now they want to impose that on everyone else. So I had to chuckle when you were telling the story of J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel, because of course the best way to get an inroad with someone like Peter Thiel is to contact him and tell him how brilliant he is. So to me, the sort of overlord mentality has got a lot to do with it. Do you think that's right?
Oh, definitely. I've been describing this as sort of an ideology of supremacy, tech supremacy, wealth supremacy, male supremacy, white supremacy, Western culture supremacy, um, you name it. There's a lot of supremacies there. And if you look at George Lakoff's conservative moral hierarchy, the hierarchical system that governs conservative thought, you see a lot of alignment with these right-wing tech plutocrats and the traditional right-wing conservatives in the United States. But there are some variances. For instance, in the Republican Party base, the evangelicals are important. The belief in God, some version of God and Jesus Christ is important. The tech guys don't really have God at the top of the hierarchy. They have technology and, more importantly, technology company founders at the top of the hierarchy. And I think that they believe that they are the most important people on the planet. They believe they are the most important people in history. Being wealthy, they're surrounded by people who don't tell them otherwise, and they have enough money to make a lot of trouble for a long time. And it's become clear that they don't plan to keep this stuff on nerd podcasts and blogs, weirdo blogs. They're going to try to scale it. They're actually going to try to make a move and destroy the United States if they can, destroy the democracy that we have here. And I think if you look at a country like Russia, where Vladimir Putin has largely turned it into a kleptocracy, autocracy, where he's the political boss for life and his group of cronies are wealthy and owning and running and whole parts of the government for their own benefit, you see a model for what they're after. And this is not just in the United States. There's a movement around the world to try to install autocrats who can then start shifting the trillions of dollars in government revenues that are generated every year toward the pockets of the plutocrats. And it is important that people be aware of that. And one of the things that frustrates me is that in your typical traditional superficial political journalist coverage, they can only imagine that it's about taxes and regulations, right? Well, the Democrats are going to bend over just as quickly on things like taxes and regulations if they have enough pressure and lobbying, right? Look at what's happening with the AI safety stuff. Tech often gets its way. Money pays both sides. These guys aren't interested in getting that from Democrats. This isn't just about taxes and regulations. These people already have more money than God. They want power. And for a long time, I've had this idea in my head, having worked with politicians, having known a few billionaires. When you have power, you want money. Politicians want to get rich eventually if they're not already. When you have money, you want power because just having billions of dollars, but nobody retweets you and you're not important is not enough. When you have both, you want to live forever. And then typically you're really screwed because nobody gets that. Well, these guys even think they're going to get that. You know, they are part of something called many of them part of the transhumanism movement, where they're trying to kind of conquer death through gene editing, through different vitamin and injection types of regimes. And if you look on some of their web pages, they explicitly believe that they're going to conquer death and have eternal life. So things are getting really, really weird in Silicon Valley, and they have enough money that it's not just going to stay within their walled compounds and among their personal cult followings of hangers-on. They are trying to inject this into the bloodstream of American politics, and they are having a good amount of success so far, with JD Vance being the pick. I didn't really think that would happen, you know, and I had tweeted a few weeks ago, if JD Vance is the pick, this stuff I've been writing about with these tech authoritarians is suddenly going to become a lot more relevant and important because of who he is. And I had people say, that's not going to happen. He's not going to pick Vance. That'd be too weird. And then it happened, right? So um, when I started covering this, it was because of what I saw happening in San Francisco and Bay Area politics, where Y Combinator, led by Gary Tan, another Teal associate, is trying to take over San Francisco city government by largely co-opting so-called moderate Democrats to support a very right-wing slate of candidates and policies. Simultaneously, a group of tech billionaires, including Mark Andreessen, whose name always pops up in these things, were trying to create a new billionaire-funded tech utopia out in Solano County, about 60 miles north. And so I saw these two things as related, and I thought I was going to write a series of stories about this attempted political takeover in Northern California in 2024, maybe write a book and warn everybody, this is what's coming down the pipeline in the United States if these guys win here. Well, much to my surprise, they ain't waiting until 2026 or 2028 or 2032. They're doing it right now. And so that's why it is so alarming. And unfortunately, mainstream papers and publications don't seem to be able to articulate it or even acknowledge it. They're really afraid of it. And I've talked to a lot of editors and reporters, and they see it, but they ain't going to say it yet.
And that's one of the reasons, Gil Duran, why I really wanted to talk to you about this, because I think it's important to convey not only how strange and extreme this movement, whatever you want to call it, is among tech billionaires, but how possible it is to become a reality, and how in certain ways it's starting to become a reality, like many things in our tech-driven world, even more quickly than we thought. You know, a while back, I'm trying to figure now, is before maybe 2014, 2015, I wrote a piece about the economist Tyler Cowen, who is very well liked among the tech elite. And he was the originator of the concept that Thomas Friedman picked up of average is over. And this was very popular. I talked to some tech people off the record back then who said, you know, there's a lot of conversation at the very, very top of the income's wealth scale in Silicon Valley about what do we do with what Tyler Cowen says is the 85% who will have no purpose in the coming world. In other words, 15% of the people who are above average, especially at working with technology in some way, will have productive roles in society. The other 85% have to be warehoused. And that came up right away at the start of your piece in the New Republic. Uh, when you talk about Curtis Yarvin, the guy we've been talking about, uh, proposing this horrific solution for the unproductive, quote, convert them into biodiesel to help fuel buses. Then he says, of course, I'm kidding, but we need to come up with, quote unquote, the best humane alternative to genocide, end quote, with dovetails with some of the things I had heard about, basically saying, hey, widespread opioid use is okay because it anesthetizes people. Internet addiction is okay because it anesthetizes people and provides raw material for our information engines, now chatbots and so on. Uh, and it sounds crazy until you realize, for example, that arguably the vice presidential candidate, the leading, certainly a presidential ticket, if not one that's in serious contention, is prepared to start implementing this right away. So, I mean, I think there is a little bit of a, and I would only add, and then I want to turn it back to you, but you rightly point out, I think, I hadn't really thought about this, that a lot of our media don't get how profound and how radical this is, because in a sense, this is where the intellectual energy is in politics. They are willing to think radically innovative, horrible, but radically innovative ideas where most of the rest of us, including in the media, including in politics, including uh, the the Democratic Party leadership. Okay, it's okay. Maybe there aren't radical ideas there, but B, I think it's outside, and I want to get your thoughts on this. It's outside, I don't know how to put it, the cognitive frame of most people in media and politics to even think this way, so they don't recognize this looming threat because it's just too strange for them to process. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, cognitive scientists call it hypocognition, when we don't yet have the words or ideas to describe what we're seeing or what we're trying to express. And that's largely been what I've been trying to do with my work. When I saw what was happening and saw the connections, I wondered, why is none of this in the newspaper? Why is nobody mentioning who these guys are, what they're related to, and now they have actually written about and talked about creating exactly kind of the things they're doing here? And I think a lot of the political coverage we get takes place on a very superficial level. I think a lot of people in newsrooms have no understanding of how ideology works or what it consists of or why it's important. They're still scratching their heads as to why Trump is so powerful and appeals to so many people. Often the explanations are very superficial. It must be about taxes. It must be about, the white identity, and it's a bit more complicated than that. And so I think what I've been trying to do is create the frames and the understanding and the simple narratives to show people what is happening with this and to make sure people talk about it. I would say my main audience, as far as I see it, has been other journalists, to get them to see what I see, to get them to see, to put together all the connections that are needed to not have to do all the work yourself. I've read many books and I'm still reading them just to understand this better and more. And I think a lot of journalists don't have time to read books. They probably have families, other things to do. So having been in a newspaper myself, you're under tremendous deadline pressure. You got to write 3 or 4 things this week, and guess what? The easiest narrative that you can just put in the paper becomes the thing you do. And so I have the privilege of having time and having space to do this work. And I do feel, based on some of the conversations and calls I'm getting, that this is about to pop and reach a different level, and people are starting to get it. And that's been my goal all along. Um, and I think now that Vance is the nominee for vice president for Trump, that in a weird way, that's what's going to make it happen. I think otherwise it would still be kind of obscure, but they just kicked it up to a much higher level. And I think people are going to have to look into what the roots of his ideology are, who sent him here, and for what purpose.
That's so interesting, and it's such important work, Gil. And maybe one way that our colleagues in media can start to process and challenge these ideas. I think, for example, in your piece, you talk about Curtis Yarvin's idea of, I have it in front of me here, of a realm, quote unquote, that of in his book Patchwork, that government is replaced by corporations because everybody wants, I guess, to be governed as if you're trying to cancel your Comcast account or something. But every patchwork would be governed by a realm, a corporation with absolute power. I'm quoting you. Citizens would be free to move, but every other realm would also be ruled by corporations. And For example, there's an all-seeing Orwellian surveillance system, as you say. Every car would know where it is, who is sitting in it, and would tell the authorities both. Uh, that I would love to see one of our colleagues ask J.D. Vance, do you agree with this idea? Or to ask him, do you agree that we should get over our dictator phobia? Just starting to pose questions because it's in even evasive answers or dishonest answers to questions introduce the idea. You and I have both learned from George Lakoff certain things, you far more than I, but even asking the question introduces it into public consciousness. And any sign that our colleagues might be doing that anytime soon?
I don't know if it'll bubble up all the way to Washington. That piece I wrote for the New Republic went pretty viral. It's still out there. People are reading it. And I've seen other pieces pop up now in places like the Bulwark talking about Yarbin. And I wasn't the first to write about this, by the way. A couple of years ago, some important work was done by James Pogue at Vanity Fair, by Andrew Prokop at Vox, but it was too early, I think.
Right,
People weren't really paying attention. Back then, it did seem like something kind of obscure, and J.D. Vance hadn't become who
right,
he is now. But all the way back in 2014, the Baffler wrote about this stuff and how it was dangerous. And this is why it's important to have magazines and to have media outlets that are not
right.
just the mainstream top ones. Now I realize that people have been frustrated that I can't. Some people are like, why isn't this in a bigger thing? It's in the New Republic. It should be in the New York Times. I'm like, things got to bubble up. You got to like go up through the ranks. An idea has to. And I am talking to some major newspapers about finding a way to put this in an op-ed format. And I've had a few op-eds in the San Francisco Chronicle on this topic, more focused on the local angle. But I hope it'll bubble up to Washington. If Kamala Harris or whoever she chooses had praised the ideas of somebody who called for democracy to be replaced with a dictatorship, she would definitely be asked about it 1,000 times. There would be 20 op-eds in the New York Times and every other paper questioning this. And what they would demand is a disavowal of this person and an explanation for why you were ever acquainted with them. People are like, well, how do you know that J.D. Vance is really influenced by this guy? Why would a guy who's running for Senate be quoting an anonymous blogger? No, not an obscure blogger. He used to write under a pen name, but now we know who he is. Mencius Moldbug was his pen name. Why would he be quoting a extremist blogger who has suggested converting poor people into biodiesel and replacing democracy with dictatorship? How would you even know that that kind of thing exists? And we'll see. I think someone has to ask that question, but we do seem to be in a media cycle where the right wing has so normalized depravity and extremism that it's no longer considered news. And this creates a great asymmetry in our coverage because,
Right.
well, Kamala can't keep staff is on the same level as Trump might be Hitler. And we tend to fixate on that more superficial